In this screencast, we're going to look at deploying SharePoint Framework components to production. This first section is going to cover working with objects and files involved in deployment, the build, bundle, and ship process, how to deploy SharePoint assets, and the deployment steps. Let's first look at the SharePoint Framework deployment artifacts and understand what things are involved. There's two different kinds of files. There's the installation and registration files, as well as the component runtime and files and dependencies. So for the installation files, these are included in SharePoint packages that are deployed to the SharePoint app catalogs. These also make SharePoint aware of these new components that are going to be included inside of these packages. It's going to include things like an application manifest or an app manifest file, feature framework files, and other things that SharePoint needs to know about. That's not the actual application though. That's going to be coming in the component runtime files and their dependencies. These are optionally included in SharePoint packages or deployed to another remote location such as a CDN or a content delivery network. These are referenced by SharePoint when the components are loaded on pages, and they're going to include things like JavaScript bundles, images, style sheets, and other assets that you may use in your components. Now, the process of creating your project is called build, bundle, and packaging the solution. And this comes in three different phases. The build process is going to transpile all of your TypeScript down to JavaScript. It's going to generate TypeScript type declaration files. It's also going to transpile all of your Sass files down to CSS. And all of these files, the resulting CSS and JavaScript files, will all be added to a new folder, a temp folder called lib inside your project. The next stage is the bundling stage. This stage is going to generate a JavaScript bundle. Now, when you do this, it's going to take all of the JavaScript and CSS files that are referenced in your project and minify them down or crunch them down into a single JavaScript bundle. Depending on how your configuration is set up, you can actually have multiple bundles generated, but that is kind of beyond the scope of what we're working with here. Just for the most part, think that the bundling process is going to generate one big bundle file that you're going to deploy. You have an optional flag of -- ship, or you can just use the -p for production. And what this is going to do is this is going to tell the bundling process to go ahead and minify and uglify the resulting bundle. And what that means is that it's going to take out all of the white space, strip out all of the comments, and do everything it can to have the files still work the exact same way, except it's going to be a much smaller file, removing all of those white space characters. The last phase is the packaging of the solution. And what this is going to do is take the resulting JavaScript bundle that was generated, and it's also going to generate all the other things that are needed to do the deployment. For example, it's going to generate all the files needed for the deployment. It's going to generate all the files needed to run the components. That may be localized string files. That may also include manifest files. The manifest files for each component are going to have a list of things like, here are the external libraries that you need to download. Here are the other dependencies that we are expecting that need to be loaded on the page. It's going to take all of these files that it generates, including all the ones that are going to have to go to SharePoint, like an app manifest file and feature framework files. And it's going to generate them and put them into a zip file. This is filing along with the Open Packaging Convention, the OPC convention. This is just a zip file, but it's been renamed to a .sppke for a SharePoint package. This file, all the loose files will all be added to the temp folder and or the SharePoint folder, depending on the use of where they're going to go. It's going to go into the temp folder if you're going to deploy things via CDN. It's going to go to the SharePoint folder for the files that are going to be deployed to SharePoint. Now, I talked a little bit about the different packaging modes or building and bundling modes of debug and production. Debug mode is when you run bundle or package solution without a ship or a production flag when you run these. All the generated files are left unminified, whereas if you included the --ship or -p attribute on the bundle or the package solution step when you're running the gulp tasks, these things, they will be minified if you include those flags. In the debug process, the JavaScript source map files are included in the transpilation process from TypeScript to JavaScript, making your debugging process a little bit easier. However, that is not the case when you add the production flags. The source maps are not generated. In addition, in debug mode, the files are built with the assumption that they are going to be loaded and run from the local web server that's generated by the gulp serve task. This is going to be running off of localhost 4321 by default. But when you run the production flag, URLs or base paths are changed to point to specific locations, either in the case if you're pointing to a CDN or if you're using the Office 365 CDN. The production flag effectively just tells SharePoint that we expect these things to be running from production, not from a local web server. Now, how do we deploy these different SharePoint assets? Well, there's two ways we can do it. For the SharePoint package, this is always going to be deployed to a SharePoint app catalog. That can be a tenant scoped app catalog or a site collection scoped app catalog. And we'll talk more about these in a little bit. The other piece that we have are the component executable files that are going to be deployed to a hosting location. The only requirement here is they must be accessible to all the users on a site. Now, you can have a bunch of different manual options. We can have it go to an Office 365 CDN. We can deploy these to an Azure CDN or a public or an internal URL that everyone has access to. The other option that you have was introduced after the general availability milestone for the SharePoint framework. It was included in the 1.4 release. There's a flag that we can add to the package-solution.json file called include client assets. And what that does, that says that if you're deploying your solution to SharePoint Online and you've enabled an Office 365 CDN, then it will include those files that are going to be executables for your components, like the manifest files, the JavaScript bundles, etc. It will include those in the SharePoint package so that when you install the SharePoint package, it'll automatically put those files into the associated Office 365 CDN for the current site collection where you're installing the app. So what are the steps for going through and building and installing your application? It's pretty straightforward. You're going to go start your application. You're then going to build it, then bundle it, and then package up your solution. You're then going to take your SharePoint package and upload it to an app catalog. Now, there's a couple little caveats here to where if you have a certain thing set up for skip feature deployment turned on or turned off, you may get a different experience. But for the most part, after you've deployed it to the SharePoint app catalog, you then are going to go to a site collection and then create a new instance of the application by going to the site contents page, selecting, say you want to create a new app, and then pointing to the app that's now available and showing up because you deployed it to the app catalog. Let's see this very straightforward process for creating a new SharePoint Framework web part and then building it, bundling it, packaging it, deploying it, and then ultimately installing it into a site collection. Okay, in this demo, we're going to create a simple SharePoint Framework client-side web part that we're going to use this for trying out different deployment configurations. This is intended to be very simple and very straightforward for the deployment piece, so we're not going to spend any time on the coding aspect. We just want to see what deployment looks like. So I'm going to start out by creating a new project here for my project. So our new folder for my project. And now I'm going to run the Microsoft SharePoint generator. Now let's go ahead and give it a name. So I'm going to say my solution is named deployment demo. It's going to be for SharePoint Online in the current folder. And then I'm just going to choose all of the other standard options. I'll just say that this is no, it's a web part. And then we'll call this our deployment demo. And we're just going to use the no JavaScript framework. So I'm going to go ahead and let npm scaffold up let the Yeoman generator scaffold the project up, and then let npm download all the dependencies. And we're going to skip ahead in the video so that you don't have to wait around for this to happen. Now that everything has been downloaded and we have all the dependencies installed, now let's go ahead and build our project. So I'm going to say gulp build. And again, what this is going to do is this is going to create our all of the necessary assets for our project that we're going to need for the bundling process. So if I take a list of all the files here, you'll see that I have a lib folder that's been generated that's going to contain all the contents of like the JavaScript and the CSS files that have been generated from TypeScript and from SAS files. Now the next step is to bundle everything up. So I'm going to say gulp bundle -- ship. And what this is going to do is going to take all the files from the lib folder and generate the JavaScript bundles for us. Now it's minifying these files for us because I included the ship flag. And the last step here is to run the package solution. So I'll say gulp package solution -- ship. So what do we have? What we're left here is I now have in the SharePoint folder, I now have this deployment demo sppkg that I can deploy to my SharePoint app catalog. So let's come over to a SharePoint site and let's go to an app catalog. So I'll come over here. And let's go to our app catalog. And I'll go to apps for SharePoint. And let's go find that package. So I'll take this package and I'll just drag it into this library. So what SharePoint's going to do is it's going to upload this file, and then it's going to prompt me and say that it's going to say, do you want to trust this solution? And what it's also going to do is it's going to list out all the different places where files are going to be pulled from in order to make these components work. Now, I chose the default options, or I just chose all the standard stuff when I created the project, and that's going to include the client assets inside the SharePoint package, because my SharePoint framework or my SharePoint online environment has an Office 365 CDN that's been enabled. So I don't need to worry about where my files are going to be deployed. They're going to be deployed to the Office 365 CDN for me. If you refer to the SharePoint documentation, it has instructions on how to enable the Office 365 CDN, and it also contains details if you want to deploy your files to a third-party CDN, such as an Azure CDN, if that was something you were interested in doing. I'm going to just select deploy. What this is going to do is effectively say that we're going to trust this for use. So if I scroll over here, you can see that everything was deployed and I have no errors in my deployment. So now let's come over to a SharePoint site. So let's go ahead and go to a site. We'll go to Devo2. And I'm going to go ahead and create or install my app into this site collection. So I'm going to go New App. And if I scroll down, I should see the deployment demo that we just created, we just uploaded a second ago. So I'll go ahead and select this. And we just need to wait for this to finish uploading. All right, here we go. My application has now been installed. So now I should be able to come over and go add my web part that's inside this package to a new page. So let's create a new page. I'll just call this my test, our test bed. And then come down here and we will go to add our web part. And if I scroll down to the bottom, I should see my deployment demo web part that we see is listed right here. So it looks pretty good. So go ahead and publish my changes. And here what this showed then is how we could go about deploying our application. Now let me show you one other thing with this that's kind of interesting. If I go ahead and open up the developer tools and I go to sources and let's refresh the page again. Now notice here I'm at my site collection. If I go to sites/dev02, notice here in my app catalog, I have client-side assets. So here I have two different client-side assets that are showing up. We just have to figure out which one is the one that we just deployed. It's not that one. Here's our deployment demo. So we created one called the deployment demo web part. This URL that you can see, it's kind of hard to see with the pop-up showing up, but where you see it's going to this site collection, sites/ and then I have this app catalog / client-side assets. Where it says client-side assets, that directory is actually mapped to a CDN managed directory, so that the Office 365 CDN is looking at that client-side assets folder, and it is deploying that everything that goes in that folder or in that library is deploying that to an Azure CDN or the Office 365 CDN, which is an Azure CDN under the covers. And so in this demo, you saw how we could go ahead and install an app and how we could use it inside of a SharePoint site, and also see how the assets are being deployed to the CDN. To get rid of the app, I'm just going to come back over here, go to the complete opposite process. I'm going to delete the web part from the page. I'll come over here to the site contents. And I'm going to remove the application, which we need to do that for now inside of the classic experience. So I'll come over here and say remove. And once it's been removed, I can then go back to my app catalog, and then I could ultimately remove this right here. I could remove this so nobody else could use or install this application inside their SharePoint Online site collection. In this section, we're going to look at site collections and the application lifecycle management APIs. And specifically, we're going to focus on a tenant scoped app catalog and a site collection scoped app catalog, and then we'll dive into the ALM APIs. A tenant scoped app catalog has been around since SharePoint Server 2013. All subsequent on-premises SharePoint Server releases and SharePoint Online is going to have a tenant scoped app catalog. This is managed by the SharePoint tenant administrators, and every asset that's deployed that is deployed in a SharePoint package that you have deployed to a tenant scoped app catalog is going to be available to all the site collections throughout the entire tenant. Now, you can then install these customizations to all the site collections throughout your tenant. Now, this is only limited. There's another option here that we can actually deploy this automatically. Like if I have a web part inside of a SharePoint framework or SharePoint package, if I'm working on SharePoint Server 2019 or I'm working in SharePoint Online, there is an option that I can say I want the customization to be automatically installed into every single site or made available to every single site. And what that would do is that would remove the step of me having to go to each individual site collection and install the app so that, say, the web part would be available to add to different pages throughout my site. This is only applicable to web parts at this time. It does not apply to any of the different SharePoint Framework extension options, such as app customizers, field customizers, or command sets. Now, another type of app catalog was introduced inside of SharePoint Online, and that is a SharePoint Site Collection Scoped App Catalog. These are only available in SharePoint Online, and they're managed by the Site Collection Administrators. Now, the way that these work is you can think of these as just exactly like they sound, a Site Collection Scoped App Catalog. The way it works is that once I upload a package, a SharePoint package, to a Site Collection Scoped App Catalog, the contents of that package are only available to that site collection. They are not available to any other site collection. So this is a good way to where if I want to have a web part that is only available to one site collection or a subset of site collections, instead of trying to hide it, I can just say install this SharePoint package just to these specific catalogs. Now, these are not automatically created by default. You're going to have to create these manually as a tenant administrator. Now, how do you go about creating this as a tenant administrator? Now, first of all, let's explain why are they only going to be available once the tenant administrator installs them? Why don't we get them by default? The reason for this is because Microsoft has taken a much more secure by default approach. When someone can add a SharePoint package to a site and then install items from that package, you're effectively giving that ability to add script files to your SharePoint site, JavaScript files to your site. You're delegating the responsibility of who's allowed to do that. So for example, when I upload a SharePoint package, I'm going to be prompted, as you saw in the demo previously, I'm going to be prompted to make sure that the application, or that I see the list of all the different URLs of where script files are going to be loaded from. And that's only listed how their files are listed externally. If I'm anywhere else throughout my project where I'm dynamically loading a file, it could still be pulled in from some remote location. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, because once those script files are running on your page, then they're going to be running under the context of the current user that's logged in. And you could be having a user that has a much high privileged access permissions to where they could then access things like, say, a mergers and acquisitions document library that not everybody should be able to see. Well, if they're on the site and there is a mergers and acquisitions document library with some confidential documents in there, and the web part's been added to the page, well, that script file is now being loaded on the page as well. And now we have the situation where the tenant administrators have delegated the responsibility of adding things to their environment, to a very important environment in the organization, to people who may not understand the implications of this. And so Microsoft said, we're going to make sure by default the only people who can deploy code to our SharePoint servers are tenant administrators through the tenant scoped app catalog. If they want to delegate a site collection administrator to also have that ability, they can do that, but they're going to have to manually do that. You can do this one of two ways. You can use SharePoint Online PowerShell, and I have a link to it there, or you can use the Office 365 CLI. This is an open source tool that's provided by the Patterns and Practices group, and it is a cross-platform implementation to where you can use this if you're on Windows or Mac OS or on Linux. They each have their own syntax for how you're going to use them, but essentially what you do is you first go log in to SharePoint Online and log into the admin center, the admin site, the SharePoint admin site, and then you're going to tell SharePoint that I want to create a site collection scoped app catalog and pass it the URL of the site collection where you want this to happen. You can also do the inverse. You can remove the site collection app catalog, but just keep in mind that they're not really removed. They're really just disabled under the covers. And what is going on is that when we added these, what happened was it was a special document library that was added to SharePoint, to the SharePoint site collection in SharePoint Online. And there were some server-side event receivers that were hooked on to that document library that said that when packages were added to the library, then it went ahead and it automatically installed those for us in that current site collection. When you remove a site collection app catalog, it's just removing the event receivers. True to SharePoint's nature, it doesn't by default delete data or delete content. And so the document library is left, as are all of the SharePoint SharePoint packages. So it may look like when you remove it that nothing happens, but if you tried to deploy a new SharePoint package, you would see that it would not get installed. It would just sit there like you were uploading it to a normal document library. If you really wanted to remove it, then you would first remove the site collection app catalog by running one of these commands using SharePoint Online PowerShell or the Office 365 CLI. And then you could go in and delete the document library. Now, the one other thing I want to talk about in this section is application lifecycle management. So what Microsoft did is they introduced a new set of APIs that enables programmatic control over the entire SharePoint package lifecycle. Previously, you couldn't do this programmatically. There had to be a user involved or someone involved to click a deploy button to make sure that apps were deployed. You could programmatically upload something to the site collection, but everything else was not programmatically controllable. So what this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow for complex automation in continuous integration or continuous deployment scenarios, as well as controlling very large numbers of deployments. So it enables, like I said, the entire life cycle of a package. You can add and remove solutions and packages to app catalogs. You can then enable or disable, which is equivalent in the UI, it's just called deploy. So you could deploy solutions and add-ins. You can then install or uninstall solutions and add-ins in a SharePoint site collection. You can then also upgrade SharePoint solutions and add-ins. And then you can also list or just get a single SharePoint Framework solution and add-in within an app catalog. These are all published as REST endpoints, as HTTP endpoints using a REST-based protocol. But there are PowerShell options and the command line interface options and CSOM options that have all been provided by the Patterns and Practices group at Microsoft, or the SharePoint Patterns and Practices group, which is both part of Microsoft and part of the community that you can use in your solutions. These are only available in SharePoint Online at this time. All right, in this demo, let's take a look at working with the tenant and the site collection scoped app catalogs. Now, in the last demo, we saw how to create a new project and deploy it to the tenant scoped app catalog. And I just want to show you that I've gone ahead and removed it from my tenant scoped app catalog. And if I go back to my SharePoint site, if you remember we were working in Dev 02, then if I come back to my site, you'll see that I have nothing installed here as well. And so on my pages site, on my test bed, there's nothing here. So I just want to make sure that you can see that I've gone ahead and cleaned everything up. Now, in this demo, we're going to look at how we can work with a site collection scoped app catalog, but we need to first create the site collection scoped app catalog. Now, I'm on a Mac OS machine, so I don't have access to the SharePoint Online PowerShell because it is not using the cross-platform PowerShell. So instead, I need to use the Office 365 CLI. The slides provided a link to where how you can go find more information about this and install it. So I'm going to show you how we can use it. So I'm going to jump back over to my command prompt. So let's first go ahead and start the Office 365 CLI. And this has already been installed on my machine. So again, refer to the documentation on how to install this. And then I'm going to say SPO login to HTTPS, and then let's go grab the site that we want to use this on. So our admin site. We're going to want to use this URL. But I need to say admin, like that. All right, so now we're going to need to go log into the site. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to copy this device login, grab this code, and paste it in, and log in. Now that it shows I've logged in, I'm going to come back over here to my command prompt, and eventually it's going to give me this little status where it just shows me I'm ready for the next command. So I could always say SPO status, and it shows that I'm logged into the admin site. Now to create the app catalog, I'm going to say SPO site app catalog add, and then specify the URL of the site where I want to do this. So for us, we want to use our dev02 site. So I'm going to grab this URL. Now come over here and I'll paste it in. Now what I want you to notice is if I look at the site contents page, notice I only have 5 libraries. But if after I come over back and run this command, and if I come back over here to my site collection and go back to the site contents page again, you'll now see a new library called Apps for SharePoint. Now from here, we can go ahead and add in an app catalog or add a SharePoint package. So let's go back and add that package that we created in the last demo. We go through the exact same deployment process. As you see here, no errors. Everything's been deployed. If I come back over to the pages or back to my site collection, site contents page, I can then create an application. So I can say new app and then choose the app that we just deployed. And after a moment, this will be installed. And sure enough, now it is installed. And from here, we can go ahead and add a component to the page. I can go add our web part that's inside that component. I can add it to one of our web part pages. Just like this. Scroll down to the bottom, and there's our deployment demo. And it looks and works just like the other one. Now, what's interesting about this is that you see here that once this has been created, if I come back over to another SharePoint site, what's special about this, if I come over here to another SharePoint site, and let's create a new site like dev3, what we're going to see is that that app is not going to be available to us to install inside of this new site. And the reason is because the app was deployed, or the package was deployed to the dev02 site collection. That means it's only available inside of that site collection. So see here, there's nothing that I can install. So much more limited list. It's pretty cool. So in this demo, you saw how you could leverage a site collection app catalog, whereas in the previous demo, you saw how to do it with a tenant scoped app catalog. In this last section, let's talk about updating SharePoint Framework solutions. We're going to look at updating the component versions and then also updating SharePoint package versions and see what the implications are of each one of these. Now, let's first understand version numbers in SharePoint Framework projects. There are two different things that we can version in a SharePoint Framework project. We can version the component itself, such as a web part or an extension, and we can version the package itself as well. Now, what's interesting about this is that it is not required to increment the version numbers of either one of these when you change code, like when you make a code change. Deploying updated SharePoint packages without changing the version numbers will still update the existing code no matter what. The component version is used just for documentation. The package version is used for documentation and to trigger the SharePoint app upgrade process. So why would I do that? Well, that's only going to be important when you do things like adding a new feature or adding a new component to your project. So when you want to update the SharePoint Framework component and increment the version number, you're going to do this. You can do this through to update the code or the configuration just for the actual web part. And the way you're going to do it is you're going to look for the manifest.json file for your component. This is going to set the version for the web part. So here you can see I have a version number of 0.0.1. Now the other option here is to put a star instead of the version number right here. If you put a star in this instance here where you see it's highlighted on the slide where it shows version 0.0.1, then the version number that is defined in the project's package.json file is the version number that this component is going to receive. And this way you can have all the components within a solution all have the same version, which is package.json's version, or you can have them have individual versions. That's totally up to you. By default, we use a star and everything in the project is going to be versioned the same using package.json. Now, what about upgrading the version inside the package itself? So what this is going to do is this is going to set the version of the sppke file. This is all going to be done inside of the package-solution.json file. And in here, you'll find a version attribute as well. This is where you can specify the version number of the package. Now, when you deploy the package or the SharePoint package to an app catalog, you will see the app version is listed. If this version number changes, this is going to trigger the app upgrade process. So this is if I change it from version 1 to version 1.0 to version 1.1, anything new that's in the package, like a new web part or a new extension or a new feature, none of those things are going to show up in your SharePoint environment until the package has been deployed or has been upgraded. And the reason for that is because the features are still used to provision all these different assets inside of SharePoint. So if I don't go through the feature upgrade process or have the feature activation process happen again, which would happen on an activate or on an upgrade of the app, we wouldn't see any changes happen. Now, last but not least, I can also update the package.json file. And this is what's going to change for every component if there's a star used inside the component's manifest for his version. Let's take a look at a demo at upgrading and updating the component versions and the package versions. In this demo, we're going to see how to change the various version numbers in SharePoint Framework components and packages, and as well as it's going to impact your deployment. Now, I'm going to use the project that I created at the beginning of this screencast that didn't really have anything special inside of it. And we're also going to use the site collection scoped app catalog that we deployed the application to in the previous demo. If you need the code for this, you can go take a look at it. It's there, but remember, there's nothing special with this code. I haven't done anything special to it. So keep in mind that in the previous demo, when I deployed the SharePoint Framework package, it contained a single web part, and the version of that web part was unchanged from the default version that was included. So if I go over here and I look at the actual web part that was created, you can see his version is set to a star. And what that means is that we're going to use the version from package.json, which is 0.1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change this to version 0.2, and I'm going to save my changes with this. Now, what I'm going to do is let's go in and let's go build and bundle. So let's go do a gulp build. And now let's do a gulp bundle -p. That's the same as doing a -- ship. Now what I'm doing, the reason I'm doing this is I want you to see how the version number is going to change. So I'm going to come over here to my project and I'm going to look at the dist folder where the manifest was created for this project. And notice here that the manifest for this component that was generated is now 0.02. So it's being driven by what's inside of package.json. Now, let's go and add a second component to this project. So I'm going to come over here to my command prompt again, and I'm going to run the Yeoman generator for SharePoint. And because it knows that I'm already inside of a SharePoint Framework project, it's just going to skip to the part that says, what do you want to create? So I'm going to say, let's create a web part. This will be our second deployment demo, and it'll also be no JavaScript framework. So we don't need to do anything special with this one either. So we're going to go ahead and skip the video ahead after all the installation stuff has taken place. All right, now let's go ahead and build and bundle the project. So I'm going to say gulp build and then gulp bundle -- ship and gulp package solution -- ship. So I'm just doing all the commands on one line, and I'm separating with the double ampersand, which basically treats them as 3 separate commands, but I'm running them in succession. So the build command is now finished. Now it's running the bundle command that you can see here. And when bundling is finished, we will now see the package solution command is going to start, and this one goes pretty quick. All right, so there we go. We're all good. Now, let's go back to our site collection that we have. Let's go to the site contents, and let's go to our apps for SharePoint. Now, I'm going to upload a new version of this package. Now, what I'm trying to show you is that I'm going to upload a new version of this package, but what we're not going to see is we're not going to see our new web part show up as an option. So I'm going to grab this package and drop it in. It's going to say, do you want to replace it? I'll say yes. Notice that the version number is still 1.0.0 because that's the package version, not the component. I'll go ahead and deploy my changes. And then once that's done, so now if I try to go add a new web part to the page, and if I scroll to the bottom, you still only see my deployment demo. You don't see the second deployment demo. And the reason for this is because when a component is being added to a SharePoint site, the way it's being added is using a SharePoint feature and using the feature framework. When the package was deployed within it, any features have to be activated for the feature to do its work. In other words, to go register the web part with the site. But without versioning the package, SharePoint didn't see any changes to the package itself, and thus it did not reactivate any existing features or activate any new features or give me any kind of an upgrade process. So what I need to do then is I need to go back to the drawing board, and we need to go version our component. So let's come back over to our Visual Studio Code project, and let's go into the config folder and look at package solution. And notice here it's 1.0.0.0. So I'm going to switch this over to 1.0.1 and save our changes. So now let's go do the exact same rebuilding process. There we go, rebuilding process done. Now, if I come back over here to my app catalog, and let's upload this solution again. Now I want you to take notice that we're still version 1.0 inside of the app catalog. When I drop this in and say replace it, watch what happens to our version number. It just got incremented to 1.1.1. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's come back over here to our site contents and go into the apps for SharePoint. Or actually we can look at it from right here. So here's the app that we've installed. So right now, if I went to the page to go add the web part to the page, so if I came over here to my test bed and I tried to add the web part, it's still going to not show me my new web part. And the reason for that is because I'm still running the old version of the app. So here, I can't see it in this experience, but what I can do if I switch over to the classic experience, and if I come over here to the deployment demo, notice here that it's still running 1.0.0. So one of the things that I can do, if I come over here and I click on the About link, what this will show me is that there is a new version that's available, which is 1.1. So if I click Get It, what that's going to do is it's going to go through the upgrade process for the app to install the new version, which is going to activate the new feature, which is going to give us access to the new web part. So that now we can see that we're now running 1.1. And if I go back to my testbed page and refresh the page, and now if I go in to go add a new web part to the page, now I should see my second deployment demo. Now it's going to show up for me. And again, the reason for that is because we upgraded the actual app. So if I modified any of the code, all the code would still deploy without having to worry about version numbers. The version number inside of the component itself is only used for documentation, whereas the version number in the package is only used to upgrade features or to activate any existing features. So in this section, we looked at how to upgrade component versions and SharePoint package versions. And in previous sections, you learned about ALM APIs, Tenant and site collection scoped app catalogs, and then also what the entire deployment story looks like for SharePoint Framework components. I've included another link here to the SharePoint Framework documentation if you'd like to read more and learn more about the SharePoint Framework. But with that, that concludes this screencast. I want to thank you for your time and hope you got something out of this.